All right. Hello, once again. And so
Oh,
all of us, Ashish, were you saying something? No, all right, okay.
oh,
So we're
fun.
not big on formal introductions. It's more of a chat for the current SY and the TY students, and sort of a way for them to gain or benefit from the fact that you have put a certain number of years behind you as compared to when you were a grad student, and in hindsight all the knowledge and wisdom that you can impart now that you know better, basically.
It's a very
So,
polished way of saying I've become old.
well, it's what you make of what I say. So, right. So, I think the first thing, because I mean, this is something that I would like to know a lot, about you as well, because the last time, like I said, the last time we met, I think was 10 years ago when you graduated and I was in my SY. So, tell us a little bit about, from SSC to TIS and then to IICRR, and, how all of that
Um,
came to be.
yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. This is nice, and like I said, it's sort of always nice to sort of sit and think back a little bit on how we all got where we did, which is something that I do personally. So it's also nice to sort of share that if it's of any use to anyone at all listening. But yeah, from Simbi all the way here, it's been sort of 10 years, like you said yourself, and it doesn't feel that much, obviously. And part of that is because not all of it was planned, which has always been the case with everything that has happened for me so far, good or bad. So I finished Simbi in 2011, and then I moved on to TIS, where I did my master's in development studies, which was a 2-year course. And to be very honest, at the time, it wasn't so much because I wanted this or because it was like this dream institution I wanted to get into. It was partly because I knew what I didn't want to do, which was MBA and CAT and everything else that my other peers at Simbi were doing at the time. I realized towards the end of my course that I wasn't doing any MBA coaching. I wasn't writing the MBA entrance, and I was in a funny situation where I was like, okay, what am I going to do next? And it was getting increasingly difficult to convince parents that I didn't want to do an MBA. And that's when I stumbled upon Tata Institute, because a friend of mine and my roommate at the time, Milind, who I think was already on your event earlier, he was applying. He was going through colleges to apply, and and he was like, this Tata Institute. He was applying for the HR course there because he was more MBA line.
Yeah.
And he was like, they also have something on development studies and like some of the other courses. So I just went up on a list and I picked development studies because it looked really interesting to me, the courses that they offered. And it wasn't because I was familiar with most of it, but it was partly because I wasn't. Like the things that they were offering were very new. They were things that we weren't really reading that much about at Simbi. So that was quite interesting for me then to sort of explore how that goes. So that's how I ended up in TIS for the development studies module, which in hindsight, I think was a decision that has changed and like shaped my my academic and my professional and my personal career in so many ways, both professionally, like I said, and personally, because you're exposed to like a very different kind of world from the one that we had in Simbi, for better or for better or worse. Again, but so that's how TIS happened. I was there for 2 years, and then I got placed and I took a job back in Hyderabad because I mean my family is in Hyderabad. I'm from Kerala, but I was born and raised in Hyderabad. I moved back home for a year. I was working with Digital Green, which is like a non-government organization that works on agriculture. So we were working with the NRLM on a Bill Gates Foundation project in 8 districts in sustainable agriculture. So I was doing that for a year in Hyderabad. Tested a few different pilot projects with them on some of the other interventions that the government was doing for the Gates Foundation, with the World Bank Foundation and things. And at the end of 1 year, I realized sort of that I needed to get back to academics, and that the NGO sector wasn't as well, not just the NGO sector, but like just the kind of work that was happening wasn't as, it wasn't giving me the kind of pleasure that I wanted from that job, or I wasn't being as optimistic anymore as I was when I joined it a year ago, and things that I needed to change in path. And that's how I applied for a second master's at King's, in London, and I got through that course. That was a 1-year master's in international political economy, which I took up. And I took that up with a fairly clear idea by then that I wanted to then apply for a PhD afterwards. I didn't know where, but I wasn't looking for the job market immediately afterwards, which in hindsight, again, I think is something that worked out well in the end, because it was also a time just after Brexit, and getting a job in the UK wasn't the easiest thing, especially if you weren't from the European Union. So a lot of my friends who were from India and were applying for jobs found it really difficult to get through beyond a stage. Whereas with academics for the PhD, I think it was relatively easy. So I got through a couple of places in the UK for my PhD after that, but I didn't manage to get funding, without which it made no sense. It was very expensive to do it, and that's when I had an acquaintance who was then doing a PhD here in Dublin, which is where I'm based now, at Dublin City University. There's an institute called the Ireland India Institute, which has been set up about 5 or 6 years ago, and they're promoting India-specific research and India-specific activities. And at the time, they were taking in PhD students, so that's how I ended up applying for it. Got the funding. It was generous. It was 4 years, which is more generous than most universities in the UK would give. So that's how I then moved here in 2015, and I submitted last year. It was 3 days before the lockdown kicked in, was my Viva in Ireland. So it was an interesting event, to say the least, because there was a lot of confusion if it's going to be, on campus or online, on campus, online. And it was online in the end, but it went quite well. And so I finished the PhD last year in March. I finished the Viva in March. I submitted the hardbound in July. And for the last year and a half now, I've been working as a postdoctoral researcher here at the Conflict Institute, which basically promotes research on societies that are transitioning from various kinds of conflicts, political, troubles, issues, but it very broadly defined. So like a lot of what we all do sort of fits into that scope. I'm doing some work for them. I'm working on some publications based on my PhD, and I'm applying for a few more funding calls just to try and extend what I've been doing, and like extend it to, say, Northern Ireland, which is another area that I'm hoping to study in the future. So that's a short sort of gist of the last 10 years of where I've been and what I've been doing where.
Great. Wow, super. That's been quite a journey, 10 years. Quite a lot.
Yeah.
All right, okay. So, I mean, now that, sort of if you look back at college, and given what it is that so since you primarily went down the road to research pretty quickly, it's not like you ended up working a lot in the formal sector, so to say. What are maybe some of the skills that you can look back and sort of you wish you knew more about or better before you started off either with research or even in your first job also? So both the things.
From my undergrad, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing that sort of comes to mind is I wish I was exposed to more variety of literature, because I feel like one of the things that we don't get enough, especially at undergrad level, is we're taught a specific kind of literature, immaterial of what subject we're doing. At least I can speak for economics anyway. I feel like I wish I was exposed to some more critical readings earlier on, even if it just means to familiarize myself with names. I mean, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I feel like there should be that option to be exposed to different kinds of literature at an early stage, and then, so that you can then pick on the ones that you like and, go on to specialize in a way you wanted. It's not a hindrance that you don't do it in the undergrad. Like, people do it at a later stage in their life. I was exposed to a lot of different kinds of literature at TIS, which I hadn't even heard of when I was at SIMBI. But that's because of the difference in, the political economy of these institutions as well. And again, it's not a good thing or a bad thing, but I often feel like a lot of my peers who were with me in my undergrad would have benefited from being exposed to a different kind of literature. And just because of the fact that they didn't go on to either do a master's or went on to doing an MBA, I feel like they probably haven't had the chance to read it. And it's probably the same for me. Like there's probably a whole different school of literature that I've never been exposed to. But I feel like when I look back, I feel like the undergrad is probably a good time to do these experiments in some sense, because the more you go on, the more you sort of become narrower in some sense on what you're doing, especially if you're in research. The expectation is that, when you're an early career researcher, when you finish your PhD, you already have a narrower field of expertise. So you sort of work from a broad area towards something narrow. So I feel like an undergrad course is a good time to sort of experiment with all of these things. And I wish there was more of that. The other thing I think when I look back is sort of being more open to asking people things. I mean, I feel like there is a certain amount of inequality that exists even within academics in certain extent. So there are certain names that you read about, and you completely think that they live in a different world, that you're not exposed to them, that there's no way of connecting with them, or no way of interacting with them or anything. And I feel like that also needs to break in some extent. Now, it may not be successful, but I feel like as students, we should encourage more of those kind of interactions with people who are much more senior academics, or the likes of that kind. I don't know. I mean, again, these things might have changed. I'm just like reflecting on how things were 10 years ago. Today, I know that there's much more, like, just because of the internet, and especially in the last 2 years, because of the opportunities that it's opened up, I know a lot more of these conversations are happening. Very senior academics are like being invited by universities and colleges in India to give lectures. There's a lot of that happening. Clubhouse has opened up a lot of these kind of discussions and conversations and things. So I think these things are changing. But me personally, I feel like 10 years ago, I had that inhibition when I hear a big name from economics. I was like, oh, this person is on a pedestal and there's no way of getting through to them. And that needs to change. I think that definitely needs to change. And I think it's partly to do with bridging that gap between academia and everything else. Like there seems to be this void between the two that doesn't connect them amply well enough. And this is both in terms of policy, but also in terms of just conversations and deliberations between these two sectors. And I feel like that it's one of those things that could change with people once they go on to do other things in life. But I feel like you need to be told early on that you need to break away from these kind of boxing people into pedestals and things like that. Yeah.
So probably one way about it is if people in academia, maybe at least for a couple of years, work out of academia, so that they, because the sort of hierarchy and the structure that you're talking about, that you're constantly supposed to look up to or revere people who are doing who are older and senior. Because I remember, right, when we were in college as well, all these guest lectures and speakers, I don't think I ever wrote anyone a cold email just to get in touch and say that, okay, this is what I study, this is what I would want to do, because there was a massive inhibition that, why would someone ever reply to us? But
no, absolutely. I think, again, I know exactly what you mean, because again, I was, I can remember very clearly when I was doing at SIMBI, I don't remember doing this, sending out an email to anyone outside of SIMBI, maybe because we didn't need to. Also at the time, you're first out of home, your priorities are different. You don't really care that much about whatever you're doing. But I remember doing this specifically when I was doing my master's, people also, because when I was doing my master's at TIS, it was an extension of all of these experiments that I wish I had done in my undergrad, both academically and personally and professionally. So when I was doing my thesis, for example, I ended up doing my thesis at TIS on Iraq for no good reason. I was doing development studies. I should have picked something else, but I just wanted to study Iraq. And I remember at the time, shooting these emails to all the authors I was reading, and most of them wouldn't reply to you, maybe, because your questions are too basic or too simple. But there might be 2 or 3 out of 10 people who do, and that already is a big motivation to go ahead and do things. And I remember very clearly that all these big names that I was reading, I shoot out emails, and one person had replied to me, and he gave me more references on what to read. And it's nice, because it also tells you that what you're doing is of some interest to someone, even if it's not of interest to people around you in what, in where you're placed. So I think that like you said yourself, there is that inhibition that we need to get out of. About academics spending time outside of academia, I don't know if that is necessarily important. I think as long as academics can find a way to engage with an audience that's wider than academia, that's sufficient. I don't think they need to like specifically go out of their way to take a sabbatical and go do something in a village, with the activist or anything. But as long as they're making their own research more accessible, and there is a politics to it, right? So within academia, when we're writing for journals, for example, it's ridiculous how inaccessible a lot of these journals are. Even if there are ways around it that we may or may not speak of, there is still a lot of, there is a political economy of it which is very problematic, right? Which feeds certain corporates, it feeds certain publishers at the expense of a lot of other people. It makes very interesting research out of reach for so many people, especially in what we now call the global south, people who can't afford to do it, who study in universities or colleges, who may not have access to these journals and articles. And I think this is where academics should make a more conscious effort to sort of step out, even if it means like writing for mainstream media organizations. And like now that I've finished and I've started writing more shorter articles from my own work for online news portals, I keep realizing how wide the gap is, like between media organizations and academics. Like there are media organizations that are constantly doing in-depth, very detailed research on something like gender, but like they're completely unaware or mostly unaware of a whole different bubble of academics who are doing very interesting research exactly on this, that they can learn from, and the academics can benefit from putting it out to people. So I think it's more about that. I think it's more about academics consciously trying to make an effort to make their research more accessible to people, which is very important, through blogs, through articles, through whatever, lectures, talks, speeches, whatever that they do. And this like idea of, there are incentives to publishing in journals, right? There are incentives, which is why people like academics like us try to do it. But then if it's the only thing you're doing, if it's going to take you 3 years to publish an article that 1/10 of the people are going to read, when you compare to writing a wider piece in a publication that gives you instant result. Like I was saying, like, the one that I wrote on tea shops recently, it was based on my research. It was based on a certain very small section of my research that I've also published as a journal article last year. But I've never received the amount of feedback for the journal article as I did for the shorter article that I wrote, because more people are reading it. It's more quick, it's quicker. People are reading it. They're getting back to you with feedback. It may be feedback that they don't like. Some people got back saying, oh, like, but you didn't look at this and that. And I'm like, thanks, because now I can look at this and that. When I write next, I can be conscious of what I'm missing. And that kind of feedback loop is if it exists, it's much slower within academic circles like journals and things like that. So I think that's what I mean when I say that academics need to sort of be a little more accessible and open, even if they don't go out onto the field and do field work in whatever sense, which I'm sure a lot of them do. If they're doing research, then they're obviously also doing some amount of field work.
But you're right. There's a lot of like this barrier about not making your work accessible, or only people within academia are I don't know, worthy of reading your work, or I don't know what that is, but that there's a lot of
it's
that.
about taking them seriously as well. Like we're doing so like there's another sort of thing I co-founded. We can talk about it later, but there was a blog called Allah which I set up with a few others a few years ago, and we're sort of doing this, trying to bridge that gap. It's an academic-ish blog, so we collect a lot of articles on Kerala from academics, but also not from non-academics. But we're doing a workshop for it, and one of the speakers who's been blogging on Kerala history for 15 years now. He's not an academic by any training, so he hasn't studied history or anything of that sort. But he's been writing on Kerala for 15 years, and he was saying this when we were at the workshop. He was saying, like, academics don't take me seriously just because I'm not a trained historian. So there is this understanding that, if you're writing blogs, that's fine, but like, it's not a journal article. Like, why not? Like, why are people stressing on having certain qualifications, a certain amount of, it may not be as rigorous as a 9,000 word article, but if it starts a debate, if it puts discussion on the table, that is, it contributes to history, So I think it's about like, who are you taking seriously, and the whole politics behind why and who people are taking seriously and why not others, I think is very problematic as well. But and then there's a whole language argument, which I haven't even like brought up, the inaccessibility of English language, and, how it's not accessible for everyone, how you have to be privileged have to have a certain kind of education to be able to articulate yourself better in a specific language, and that's a whole sort of different debate, I think.
Yeah. So the work that's done through the vernacular languages is anyway, I mean, half the journals won't even publish it, but so that sort of makes it inaccessible, right? No, so this is an excellent segue to the fact that you spoke about the writing workshop. So we do have a lot of students who are interested either in journalism later, or a lot of them also write blogs of their own now. So so like, what tips and tricks to write and write better, and how did you come about this, by the way? I mean, did you just start writing for your thesis, and is that how, or did you even write?
You mean the blog that?
Or no, the blog, and in general writing.
Oh, writing in general. I think I mean, I think with most academics, this is something that we spoke about as well, is that like with most academics, what happens, I feel, is our serious reading only starts by reading academic stuff, right? Like you don't, like not everyone has a privilege to have a childhood where they've been reading all these novels and like books in English or what, and it's probably increasingly less. So like back in our days, maybe like, you picked up whatever Famous Five or any of these Enid Blyton books and you read. I don't know if people are doing that anymore with the mobiles and everything that's come in. But one of the things that happens is like our serious reading with like our serious engagement with literature sort of begins when we're in college, right? Where it begins when we start reading these textbooks and like these famous economists or whoever, politicians, whatever, political theorists or whoever. And obviously what happens with that is that it shapes the way we write, right? We start writing in a way that we're reading, right? So the more you expose yourself to a specific kind of writing, the more morbid your writing becomes, because you start writing like that, because it's the only way you've exposed to. So that was happening quite a bit. So I realized when I started writing my thesis, a lot of the other things that I'm writing were sounding very similar. And then I consciously had to make an attempt to read different kinds of things, dabble in different ways of writing or like presenting your work. Even if it means like, I don't know, at the moment I'm like in a writing group with other people where I'm trying to write fiction, not because I know how to write fiction, but because I feel like even if it's going to be bad fiction, it's important that I put it out there, because there needs to be other ways of writing that is non-academic, right? So I think one of my advice would be for anyone who's sort of like trying to do these is like, like simply just try different formats of writing. And I think it definitely helps. It may not be good. Look out for workshops, look out for groups of people who are like getting together to do this. And that I think definitely helps. The other thing I think is, this is increasingly something I'm trying to do, is also to look at other ways of presenting our work to people. And this goes back to what I was saying, is like, is about making your work more accessible. I do photography, which is another sort of big part of what I'm interested in. And increasingly I'm trying to incorporate photography into my academic interests as well, which is more to do with public spaces, city space, social spaces, that kind of space, basically. And that's also opened up a very interesting avenue for me, right? So it's also opened up how I can present my work, not through writing necessarily, but through things like photo blogs, for example, or like making videos. And as academics, I think, again, there is that block when it comes to things like this. I mean, it's in journal articles. There are journals that I know of which will clearly say we don't publish photographs. And you're thinking, why not? Like, why is it that a certain medium is meant to be better than the other? When I was submitting the PhD here, there is still, even when you're writing a PhD as a PhD student, when it's your piece of work, there are still inhibitions about using photographs. And when I tell people I'm using photographs, they're like, oh, that's interesting. We didn't think of that. I'm like, why not? Like, what is stopping you? It's your work, and there's no rules against it. And it also is a very interesting medium, because the more you think about it, the more it also addresses some of the other problems that we spoke about, specifically, for example, to do with language, right? And again, this is reflections from the writing workshop, which has happened. So I'm going to just throw it out there for anyone who's interested. But see, what is happening increasingly also with our generation is that we have a language problem in some extent, right? So like, my parents are from Kerala. We speak Malayalam at home. So I think in Malayalam, but I was educated in English, right? So my writing happens in a different language often from the one that I'm thinking in, right? Or or vice versa, Sometimes I'm thinking about something that I want to write in Malayalam, but I can't, simply because I don't have the skills to do it, right? And again, if you look at other mediums, sometimes they help you overcome these things. Like if I'm using a photograph to put forth a point instead of writing about it, then it becomes universal in some sense, because then language doesn't become as important as it is for the text, because it doesn't matter what language you speak. When you look at a picture, you sort of interpret it in your way. You're giving that agency not to you as the one who's producing that work, but to the audience who's looking at it, right? So that's another very useful way I think increasingly we should think of, is to like sort of not limit what we're writing into a specific form of text, but to think of other ways of presenting it, even if it means YouTube videos or whatever, whatever. I wrote an article on photographs in Malayalam cinema recently, which was sort of text heavy in the beginning, and then I pitched it to, we published it for Allah, and then I pitched it to a different publication, which is more pop culture. It looks at a younger crowd, more active on Instagram kind of page. And they instantly asked me, I went to them and I said, do you want to publish this article? As a good academic, I was like, this is the only way things should go out. And then they said, why don't we make it into a video? And give it a voiceover. And I was like, that is brilliant. Like if it, and then they did that. So they just took the article, they redid the script in a way that works for that format. And they just made it into a video, which worked even better in my opinion than the article did, right? Because it's to do with photographs and cinema. So like the moment you have that photograph on screen, or you have that that visual from that film on screen, it automatically adds to the experience. It's an audio-visual experience. It's not just a reading experience, So I think there are these very interesting ways in which academic research needs to be put out. So anyone who's like trying to write in more accessible ways, my opinion would be to think, my advice would be to think about these things. Obviously, the incentive to do this is lesser because it will not count as much as a journal article does. But I think that's a balance that like each person has to make for themselves, about how far, it doesn't have to be one or the other, as long as there is that balance between the two.
Yeah.
Super. I think that's pretty much, I think that's what I have to say. I don't know how useful that is, but
so while we're on the topic then, so do you have any book or blog or podcast recommendations? So either they could be related to writing itself, or like what are you reading currently? Like
podcasts, I haven't actually listened to enough recently, because podcasts used to be what I listen to when I'm on a walk or on the bus, and none of that has happened in the last year and a half. So I haven't been listening to too many podcasts. I recently actually listened to what's his name, Anurag minus Verma. Anurag minus Verma, he's doing these podcasts on Indian politics and Indian history and things like that, and I heard a couple of his episodes.
Right?
Sorry,
Amit Verma, are you talking about?
No, I think his podcast is called Anurag minus Verma. I don't know. I could be wrong. Anyway, so his podcast was quite interesting. I listened to a few of it. Blogs wise, I would be happy to pitch Allah.
Oh yeah.
If anyone's interested. But also I recently came across one called Open Dosa, I think, which might be interesting for some of you, at least because it's run by a group of third-year students from Bangalore. I think I can't remember which college, but one of the colleges in Bangalore. It's run by students, and they've been putting out some really interesting blogs. I've been reading some of their posts in the last few weeks, just because we have some participants who are from that circle, so we've been reading a little more of their work. But yeah, these are what I've been reading in terms of blogs. For books, I'm again, like I was saying, like a good person, I'm trying to dabble with what am I reading? So I picked up fiction. I picked up this, which is S. Harish's book called Mustache. It's a translation of a Malayalam book. Now I thought twice before buying it if I need to buy the original Malayalam or the English. I can read Malayalam, but I'm terribly slow. So I decided to pick up the translation in the end, which I haven't started reading. And the other academic one I'm reading would be this one called Rediscovering the City. It's by a photographer who traveled around New York and documented the city and like people and how people behave in public spaces. Like how long are people talking to each other on the streets? How long are they standing and chatting before they move on? What are the time periods in which people gather around specific areas. So he noticed, when people are going to work, they spend this much time sort of chatting with each other. So it's just like a lot of like numbers, but it's also using loads of photographs and pictures to sort of say something about the city and where people meet and greet. So it's an interesting read. I've only started reading both of these now, so hopefully it'll be an interesting work.
So since your work is in and about the use of spaces and public spaces in general, do you think there is enough of an outreach, so to speak, from the government? And especially now I'm talking about local urban level governments, right? Because they're the ones that are primarily responsible for planning and city development and all of that. And do you think they have an in-depth understanding of these concepts? And B, do they actually make an effort to try and understand more by reaching out to people who actually study? So let's say maybe someone like you in case of Kerala, because you have worked on it and you've written a lot about it. So do you find that they're open to funda in the first place, and B, is this engagement there?
I think yes. The short answer would be yes. There is increasing awareness of some sense of like the importance of public spaces, and I think it partly comes from I think it was David Harvey who said increasingly under neoliberalism, when everything is going away from being physical spaces, you're realizing how important physical spaces are in some sense. When you see and I think like a good example that I really like going back to based on my own sort of work is if you compare a political debate that happens between friends in a tea shop in Kerala or like a library in Kerala, and compare that with a WhatsApp group with the same number of people, or a Facebook interaction between people, you already see how one is better than the other. Well, not better, but like how they work in different ways, And I remember when I was doing my fieldwork, there was a man now middle-aged in his 40s, and he studied. He lived in a small village in Kerala, and he said that this is in the 70s and 80s when he was growing up, and even up to the 90s, I think like the youth clubs were a big thing in Kerala, and libraries and reading rooms, which was an essential part of public sphere in Kerala, which is where people, mostly men, it was a very masculine space, but it's where like you met people, you made friends, you discussed politics, you chatted about everything, gossiped, all sorts of things happened there. And he was saying, obviously, once they grew up, all of his friend circle, they moved to different cities for jobs. But now they've all made a WhatsApp group, and they've named it after the same name that the youth club had when he was back home. But he was saying, very interestingly, that like the other day somebody discussed something on politics, and other people went up and said, "Oh no, like we shouldn't be discussing politics here," which is what we see in a lot of WhatsApp groups. I have seen it in family groups where we put up something political, and people are like, "Oh no, we don't want to talk politics." That's a kind of thing that would never happen in a public space, not never happen, but like, you have Kerala, tea shops in Kerala that famously have boards that say don't talk politics, but that's because it gets into like physical fights or whatever, but it's not a norm, it's not a norm to not talk certain kinds of politics. And I think it's because of how differently an online space shapes that interaction. So I think there is a lot of awareness around the need and importance of placemaking, the importance of creating secular social spaces that are inclusive, that are safe. A lot of this argument is coming from feminist circles, and very rightfully so. The importance of making public spaces, and if you look at Why Loiter, Shilpa Phadke's work on Why Loiter, the importance of public spaces for women, having safe public spaces for women. I think a lot of that is happening. What I think isn't happening enough is, like you said, like how seriously the authorities are taking this. And I think still a lot of this work seems to be happening from the civil society sphere. It seems to be happening from, well-wishers who are getting together and trying to do this. And sometimes the institutions take them on board, sometimes they don't. Like for instance, again, I keep falling back to Kerala because it's the case that I know of. But in Trivandrum, there's this one stretch of a public road called Manaviyam Vidhi, which is in sort of a central part of Trivandrum. For like whatever 15 years now, every weekend they've had a thing where a group of people come together and they perform music, dance, art, all sorts of things, to a level where now it's automatically appropriated that character. It has become a space where artists gather and talk and everything, and the group were able to mobilize and then put pressure on the government to cut that road off completely for traffic. So now that road is just for this. So, like the walls are completely full of art. They have film exhibitions. They have all sorts of events that happen in that space. It's a very inclusive, very LGBT friendly space, which is again something that is hard to find in a lot of senses in India today. So these things are happening, but a lot of it is happening. Initiation is happening from the civil societies, and then the state sometimes picks on it. Now in Kerala, we thankfully have a state that that cannot ignore these kind of demands that come in, whereas in other states I would assume it's not as easy to get heard even if you're doing something like this. But I know these initiatives are happening now. The government has tried to sort of expand that model and decided to have at least one such space in every district. Is something that they pitched as an idea because they realized that this is important. I know Bangalore has a similar space that's come up now. There's like one stretch of a road, I can't remember what it's called, but there is a certain stretch of the urban space which has been sort of left out for such art and things like that. So I think these things are happening, especially in the cities, which makes sense because I think it's more important in the cities to have it because there are more organic spaces in the villages. In the rural areas, these spaces automatically, in some sense, you have like the village tree or the crossroads or wherever people conglomerate to some extent. But I think it's changing. I think it's happening, however, slowly, and people are realizing that you need, especially in the last 2 years when everything has moved online, we have suddenly a sense of, okay, we're missing out on something that we took for granted for too long.
Absolutely.
So I think that's happening as well slowly.
Yeah. Cool. All right, guys. Any questions? By the way, I'm happy to hog the entire hour, but if anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Either which way. Yes, Anusha, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Hello. Hi, Hari. So my question was that when you were speaking about the use of public spaces in Kerala, so what have you observed in Ireland which maybe draws a parallel to how it exists in India just at large, not just in Kerala, but yeah.
Are you saying how are public spaces in Ireland similar to ones in Kerala, or how are they different? Is that
right? So, I mean, how are they similar, and how are they? I mean, it kind of spawned in my head because of what you guys were discussing at the beginning about how academic institutions all over are, pretty much the same.
No, I think there are. It's again something that I'm still reading about because, like I said in the postdoc, is when I'm trying to explore what I did in Kerala and try to do it in some other contexts. But the one thing that I feel like we don't think about enough is how blessed we are in India with the weather, because the idea of like sitting in a public space outside anywhere isn't as easy across the world. Like here, for example, we have a good summer in Ireland for about 3 months or 4 months in a year, but for the rest of the year, you're looking at very gray, very rainy, or very cold weather, right? Which automatically means sitting outside is limited to some extent, which means a lot of the public spaces like parks, we have loads of parks here, which is like arguably the biggest public space we have, which is great for the summers. But then the moment summer's over, you have to rely on public spaces, but not free ones. So like a restaurant, a pub, a cafe, some of these spaces, right? And that I feel like is a difference. And I think it purely just falls back on weather to some extent, because you can do that you can sit anywhere in India under any tree and sit and chat to some extent. But that apart, I think there's not too many differences in the interactions themselves, in the sense that I feel the interactions are as inclusive. I feel like here they're probably a little more inclusive in some sense, because I don't know, like I said, the public spaces here, like parks, anyone can go in to some extent, whereas I remember doing my research, I was sitting in Thrissur in the Round, which is like the center of the city, and there's like all these trees and shade there. It is a public park in all sense of the word, but even today, if you go and see there, most of the people who would be out sitting, chatting with friends would be men. There is still that issue that happens. I mean, this is not to say that women don't use public spaces in Kerala, but it's probably because they have different kinds of public spaces. There's some really interesting work that's coming out now from sociologists on what they call private publics, which is like how women from a neighborhood sort of meet up just outside their houses. So it's not a private space, but it's also not the public in the sense that we understand the public. So, it also sort of indicates towards moving beyond these binaries that we have in our head of what is public and private. And I have fascinating examples of this from Kerala history that I won't go into because then this can just go on forever. But yeah, I think
you could give us one or two. I mean, you can just
paint the picture. I have a couple that I absolutely love, and I think I would like to put it out there actually, because like when I went into this PhD that I was doing, you have these senses of what is public and private, right? So you have a sense that a private is home; it's when your life is controlled, your space is controlled, and the public is everything that it isn't, which is going out and everything.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in Kerala, if you look, for example, if you look at the caste and caste structure in Kerala, you'll see that one of the most oppressed communities, despite being upper caste, were the Brahmin women, right? They had absolutely no control over their body, their space, their control, their agency. It was all controlled by the men in the Brahmin community. But really interestingly, I was reading this autobiography of this lady who wrote at the time, and she had some really interesting insights on how we understand this public and private. So she was saying that every month when the Nambudri, but the Brahmin women were menstruating, they were asked to remain locked inside a room for 4 days, right? It's because they were considered impure. They didn't participate in anything that's happening. Nobody in the family met them except for the one helper, who was allowed to go in, the one helper girl who was allowed to go in. In every sense of what we understand, it is probably the most private space, right? It is when the body is controlled, when she's not allowed to leave the one room. But very interestingly, apparently, there were instances when they looked forward to this because it was the one time when they could smuggle in translations of books from Bengali or from like Europe that were being translated into Malayalam. And they could sit inside that room and they could sit and read all of this revolutionary literature that was coming out from different parts. Now, they had to smuggle the books in, interestingly. And the second thing was they still weren't allowed to touch the books. So they had the helper lady sitting there turning pages for them as they were reading. So it is fascinating how, because like being exposed to such revolutionary literature is on the other hand the most public thing you can think of, because in some sense it is where you're moving away from the private space and looking at everything that's happening in different parts of the world. That's public, so to speak. It's fascinating, and another space that was common for women at the time was when they went to bathe. So when they went to the bathing ghats with other women, again, a very private space. But that's where they would smuggle in pamphlets that was talking about revolutionary ideas between the Brahmin community, that, the idea of like why you need to get out of this caste system and sort of fight and things like that. Another example is like how slave schools at the time within the Dalit communities happened in the homes of people because they didn't have access to any other space, right?
Right.
So a lot of their schooling happened in the houses of people from the Dalit community. So like what I'm saying is like, so these negotiations define how we have gone on to understand questions of public and private. So a lot of these interactions now don't happen to don't need to have in the public. Once you have a clubhouse room in some, for example, it in certain ways it is doing what a tea shop was doing back in the days, but in certain ways it isn't. So these things are also constantly changing, I feel like. So there are different ways and we all adapt. And this is going back to Anusha's question earlier. And I think like in every society, we sort of adapt different ways in which the public sphere works. But the one thing that is certain is that like the more spaces are tried to be controlled by the governments, by the castes, by capital, whatever dominant hegemonic power that there is in society at the time, the more ways we will find to sort of work around it. And we meaning people in general, that is always, it's a fascinating thing to just like look at and how these negotiations happen. And these are very like society specific. So there would be similarities and differences even within India. Like why compare Ireland to India? If you compare Kerala with Hyderabad, where I grew up, there is a different kind of social space. There's a different kind of public sphere. There's a different kind of interactions that happen. But they seem to work for that context. So why not? Yeah,
super. No, in fact, with the example that you gave about the women reading the books when they were menstruating, my point is that even then, so they were reading revolutionary literature, but they still wouldn't touch the book. I mean, that's the irony, right? I mean, because I mean, it's so ingrained that
absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also goes back to the question of how we understand space as something that's outside of ourselves as well. So here you had like, if you compare the outside space, you had like a public event happening in some sense in a private space, but then even then your body, which is the most private in a lot of senses, was still impure. Like, you know, so you could be a private within a private. That doesn't work in some sense. So yeah, I mean, these things are always around, and it's very interesting to look at these negotiations as well. And in some sense, like understanding how these concepts were developed in early 20th century is also important in understanding how caste and religion are working in Kerala today. You know, like why is it that certain things are coming back up? Why is it that caste is coming back up in a way that that is surprising people? And when you look at these negotiations, you realize there is no need to be surprised. Like caste is always there, like in Kerala, religion and like conservative thoughts were always there. It just never simmered out into the public as we understood the public. So secularism was fine as long as it's not inside my house. And like increasingly when those lines are being blurred, you see that these conflicts are sort of becoming more and more evident and out in the open.
Yeah, I guess now with the current central ruling party trying to make inways into Kerala, it's sort of coming out into the open that people are maybe being not forced to pick a side, but they have the choice of being vocal.
Yeah.
I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I know it's an interesting one with the BJP in Kerala. And I think it's like, to my understanding, it's just to do with the numbers. It's just to do with how like the Christian Muslim votes are more concentrated in Kerala, whereas the Hindu votes are very sort of divided to some extent. And also the fact that thankfully we have like a history of a strong sort of people-led social movement that relied on the importance of education, public, you know, the importance of having a public education system, a public health, and a reformation movement from the late 19th, early 20th century that was very much based on the ideas of equality and equal justice, which interestingly didn't start from top down, which I think is quite different in Kerala. Like the fact that a lot of these reform movements started from the not from the upper caste communities, but from the oppressed communities, and that I think has been important in shaping the nature of that discussion. And the fact that, like, you know, the left movement was then able to pick that up also helped to some extent. So definitely there is that, but again, the thing is, it's easier always to sell communalism than it is to like sell secularism, and this is always the case, you know. So that challenge will always be there, and we'll find ways to work around it, I guess, to some extent. But yeah, it's interesting anyway. To like, especially with the last election, there was a lot of discussion on what it means, and the BJP may not have done in terms of numbers, they may not have done well, but I think in terms of like shaping the political discourse, BJP has emerged as an important player in Kerala. You know, it has broken through that left and center dichotomy that we've had in Kerala for so long, and it has managed to dictate a lot of political discourse, has managed to set agendas on certain issues, and force the reaction from the center and the left in Kerala. You know, so these things are happening, these changes are happening now. Where they lead and like how they're met is obviously a thing that we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. I think these are the similar patterns that are being seen across the southern states, right? Because so Tamil Nadu for the longest time had a two-party system. Now, you know, you have BJP trying to break in over there. Then here as well, the kind of two-party system differs definitely, but you know, it's the fact that
absolutely. Absolutely. But the thing is, like, as long as they have like a national party Hindutva image, that wouldn't be easy, because I feel like, especially in Tamil Nadu, like their regional identity is so strong that like to break through that with that kind of you know, Hindi heartland image would be quite difficult. I mean, it's not impossible like we're seeing, but it would be difficult. So we'll have to sort of, I guess, wait and see how that shapes.
All right. And I had, at least from my end, I have another question for you. So with the blog that you write and, you know, for your own thesis as well. So what's your writing process like? I mean, do you stick to a specific time of the day where, you know, even when it was for your thesis, or, you know, when it's for the other the other articles that you write? So do you have like a process, or do you just...
The short answer is no, I don't have like a fixed process, but I do, like any good academic, I have like at least 20 different word files that I have on my laptop as of now, which most of which are like one thought that I have at the middle of the night where I wake up and go, oh, this is an interesting thought, and I just put it down before I forget. And that's all it is. It'll be that one line that I never work on after that. But what has worked more successfully for me has, I think, been sort of, I mean, so this is what I do. Like there are like I read quite a bit as much as I can. First, I try to sort of sit down and like not focus on writing, but sort of read and internalize what I need, especially if it's something that I'm not that I don't work on. That's not something that I know enough about. And then what's always helped is sort of bouncing these ideas off my friends or peers. Like I have like a group of friends who I'm happy to discuss these things with, and I tell them that this is something I want to write about. So I just think I want to like throw these ideas off you, think what, get a sense of what you think. And this is throughout, even if I'm doing a journal article, like when I was writing my last one, I had to structure it in a specific way. And I sat down with like 3 of my friends and I said, this is how I'm structuring it. Does it make sense? So sometimes they said it's not that clear, especially if you're not aware of the context, you might want to redo some bits, and that I've found very helpful personally. And then it's just about sitting down and writing. And like, again, the first time I don't look for a draft. I just I don't open any tabs. I just sit down and write everything from what I have in my head. Even like, and this is a very interesting process, because I remember very clearly times when I start doing this and I think, yeah, I'll probably have like 200 words and that's all I'll have. And I end up writing like 2 pages. Because just because it leads to something that you've thought, and like at that point I'm not editing, at that point I'm just putting everything down, everything that comes into my mind first. I do that, and then it goes into, okay, what are the interesting tangents where I need to add more things, what do I need to cut down on. And then once it's done, I usually, again, I run it by a couple of my friends if I can, if they're free to read it, just get their feedback on what I need to add, what I need to change. And then I put it, and then a lot of the times, even after that, I get loads of trolls coming in and saying this is that and this is this. So whatever works for everyone, I guess.
I don't think there's anything one can do about the trolls. It's just your own process that matters at the end of the day.
I think like you eventually develop that thick skin. Like I realize that it doesn't affect me as much anymore, like it did 3 years ago. It was a lot worse 3 years ago. Like I remember being very affected when somebody comes and calls me names and says go to Pakistan, or like, oh, you're sitting abroad, like you don't care, you don't need to speak about whatever. Which is a really funny thing, and like I think about this quite often. Like I've lived outside of India now for 7 years now. And like in both the countries that I've lived in, I've participated actively in political events. Like, if it's to do with the abortion rights here, or if it's to do with, the climate, whatever, or the anti-war campaigns in the UK, whatever. Not once have people come up to me and said, oh, you're not from here. Like, why are you talking about whatever? Whereas in India, we have that sense. Like when a German student decides he wants to protest on CA and RC, his visa gets cancelled, he gets sent back. These things are like there needs to be a change in how we understand these things. Like why can't we have political differences? When has it become such a big, I mean, I wasn't this when like the UPA was in power and we were sitting there constantly sort of questioning and challenging and like writing and saying things against the UPA. Like nobody asked us to go to Pakistan then, like why is that? Like why does that have to change? I think
we're becoming increasingly territorial about
territorial or primordial, I think one or the other. It depends on how we try to define the politics of each political party. The Congress's understanding of nationalism might be more civic, the BJP's might be more primordial. That difference will reflect in the political discourse, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. But I guess the only solution is to write more and to voice more.
I don't know if it's a solution. Like increasingly there is this anti-intellectualism where you're writing and like people are going, oh, you don't know anything about this. You're just like whatever, an armchair sociologist sitting and writing about something, whatever. Which is part true, I guess. Like you can't like, but at the same time, I'm like, what? Like so you're a troll, then you just get into name calling and then it doesn't get anywhere. But yeah, we try. I think like a lot of the writing comes from optimism and from the understanding that despite all of these things, there is an important to have all of these conversations because they're important, and because as young academics, as young students of politics or economics or whatever, it's also an interesting time where there is so much available to us, like today, if you want to write, you don't have to worry about the the journal articles coming and accepting it. You can start your blog, you can start, set up a Medium account, and you have that entire space for you to write whatever you want. It doesn't, like, there's no, I mean, the fact that there is no editorship can be good or bad. Again, it means you can put anything out there, but you can put anything out there, like it's there for you to take. So I think those opportunities are there. Again, the only thing I would suggest again is like try and explore different kinds of writing. It's always it's a very liberating experience as well, especially if it's an area that you're not very comfortable with, because it forces you to think in ways that you didn't realize you could engage in, like whatever different kinds of activities. Like for me, it has been photography or like doing something else on those lines, but there's always something that we like, and like try different things. And I think, like, again, going back to the undergrad is probably the best time to do these experiments, because I feel like the more even if you have the motivation to do it at a later stage, there are societal pressures, that force you towards working in. I mean, I've been very lucky that my family has let me loose in some sense, vaguely. They keep reminding me about the need to find a job and settle and all of these things in life at some point, but there hasn't been the kind of pressure that a lot of my peers have, so increasingly, like now at this age, like I'm still looking at things and I'm going, oh, this is really interesting, I want to try do this for a bit, and then this is really interesting. But you're consciously, like, at this age, you have that at the back of your mind where you're like, okay, but like, listen, you need to start sort of settle down, simmer a little bit. As well as in academics, because like we keep, again, this keeps going back to what I was saying earlier, is that in academics you're constantly reminded of the need to be an expert. Like I was seeing a tweet that a friend of mine had put out the other day, where she was saying an academic had once told her that if you're interested, if you continue to keep writing on all sorts of different things, you will never be the one person. And she was like, that's fine. Like, why do you want to be this one exceptional person who like knows everything about, one thing, where you can be this person who's intrigued about all sorts of different things and is trying to write interesting things, is trying to learn more interesting things.
Yeah.
So why not, So yeah.
So I don't know, but I think that's really good advice, especially for these kids at this point of time, because soon enough, like you said, everyone will start trying to push you towards some specialization, towards some niche. You have to narrow down to something. So yeah, I guess this is the good time.
And it's not a matter of good or bad. Like I'm sure there are people who are experts on one area that works for them. But to assume that it's the only way to work in academics is I think very problematic. And because it doesn't have to be, especially not today. When even if you are doing that, it's such a competitive, such a difficult space to be in academia. Like it's so competitive. You have to get used to something like rejections. You're constantly applying for jobs, for journal articles, for whatever you're applying for. There are so many rejections in academia that like you have to be able to very you have to be sort of thick-skinned to move beyond it in some extent. And that, I think, again, goes back to what I was saying, is like, how do you see yourself as being that academic? Do you want to be that person who's like, dedicated completely working on one thing, or do you want to experiment more, write more, do more accessible work, or whatever it is, like that makes you happy? But to think that one is the right way, I think is problematic. And I think we need to, especially as young students, I think it's useful to think about the different ways in which you can do interesting things, and that don't necessarily have to bind yourself to a specific way of doing things.
Right. Makes sense. Great. Wow. The time has flown and we've sort of touched our deadline. But Hari, where can the students reach out to you? So if they want to write to you maybe about...
I'm quite active on Twitter. If people are on Twitter, I'm not... I can share my email address if that helps.
I have your Twitter handle.
I think I've shared it with you, Saylee, so feel free to sort of share it with people if they would like to. Twitter, anywhere really. I mean, I'm
just put up your Twitter handles then.
Yeah, it's Hari Krishnan S.
Yes.
91, I think, something like that. Yeah, it's.
Yeah, if you can just put it in the chat box then.
I'll do that now. That's me on Twitter, and I'll put down my email address as well. Yeah. That's my email.
Yep.
So yeah, either of those is fine. Oh yeah, I see you shared the link to Allah as well. Thanks.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
yeah, so
I've been
anyone
going through a couple of.
who's willing to write on anything to do with Kerala, Malayalam, migration from Kerala, Gulf, whatever, as long as it's broadly under Kerala, please do write to us if you're interested, if you'd like to feature some of your work. We're especially looking out for younger academics as well, like I said, because we want to encourage that. So we've had a few students who did like some field work in a part of Kerala, and they wanted to write about it, and they couldn't find space within the thesis that they were doing, or whatever. So we've done some of that in the past. We'll work with you to sort of get it into shape if that's something that they're looking for as well.
Right,
But,
right. No, definitely. I do think we have some students from different parts of Kerala as well. And I'm guessing right now, I mean, everyone is working from home, so they are back home. So
yeah,
I'll see. I'll reach out to them and I'll ask them if if they have anything that they would want to talk to you about. That would be great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking out your time. I know it's you've had to make time for us, but
pleasure. Thanks for having me, Saylee. It's nice to chat with everyone. And yeah, good luck with everything that you're all doing.